Hi, welcome to the Class Sales and Retention Prediction Series, part of the Class Vendor Excellence Series. I'm Taylor Davis. I'm the statistical geek over the model, so you'll be seeing me in all these videos, and I'm here with Kyle Chilton, who's one of our expert analysts in the imaging space. So thank you so much for joining us, Kyle.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So before we jump in and talk about 9 different markets that we're watching and we're making some predictions on, we are going to just give a quick level set on what this model is and how do we think about this model, and a few caveats before we jump in. First, please know that this model is a model. So there's a saying with statisticians, the stupidest statisticians believe their model too much. And models are not perfect. If you want to know more about the model, we don't have time today to dig into it, but here's the link as to where you can go and learn more, and we've been communicating that out to vendors. This webinar and all of these webinars are for vendors only because we're not reporting these predictions out to providers. This is to help vendors improve, right? And it's really important to know what the limits of a model are. So there's a lot of things that you and I will know and our audience will know and say, well, that's weird. That vendor shows up really weird. They were just recently acquired. That looks really silly. Well, yeah, the model doesn't always know all of those type of things, such as ownership changes or the comprehensive landscape or differentiation factors in the market. And the more weird that a product is, the worse the prediction is going to be in the model. And if it's not a bad prediction, it's probably just lucky. Because if a model is really weird, it has a really niche customer base, or there's some real unique dynamics in the market, the model's just not going to be very good at predicting that. So anyway, let's give a quick overview of how this model works. And as we talk about this model, here's a conversation that you almost would never hear. You hear the full conversation. Let me show you the first half that never stops here. So if I came to you, Kyle, and I said, hey, did you see that movie? There's a new movie out. I said, hey, did you see that movie? Did you like it? And maybe you come back and say, yes, I loved it. I never would just stop right there. I've never heard anybody. You know the next question is a why question that I'm going to ask. So what did you like about it, really? Which is a why question, even though I said what. And here you have a lot of different options of what you could say. You could say, I love the special effects, or I love the characters were amazing, or it's the most creative movie I've ever seen. But what you answer, I'm going to match up to what I'm looking for, and that is going to make the difference. So how often have you received a recommendation on a movie, and then you walk away going, I know they loved it, but I am not going to love that movie, right?
Yep.
And so that's the very same type of thing that we see in healthcare technology, is we believe that when potential customers go to market, they're not just asking, hey, are you happy or not, which is the class score is a manifestation of whether they're happy or not. They're asking, why are you happy with it? And that why is really what they're matching up against what they are looking for to be able to know. And there's a common set of whys that really make a difference. And those are innovative vendors. People are looking for that. They're looking for market leaders. They're looking for high integration. They're looking for high partnership. And when we look at what customers are looking for, there's other things that you maybe would think, well, maybe they're looking for high support. Well, as we dig into this, and we've done a lot of interviews, we know that support maybe is something that I'm not, it's a plus and I'd like it, and I'd like to not hear about miserable support, but it's also something that I know can go away really quickly. And so there's some things I'm looking for. There's some things that maybe would be nice, but are not the most critical things that I'm listening for as a potential customer. So as we talk about this, we need to talk about the idea of question rank. And the idea of rank is just to take all of the rating questions the class has from high to low, and to look at those questions that are the very highest rated. And we can assume that those are likely, just like in the movie answer, those are likely the ones that customers are talking about the most energetically. So if those questions around innovation, executive partnerships, market leadership, and supporting integration goals, if those questions are towards the top of the list, even if the product rate's a little bit lower, we would expect that product to be more aggressive or more successful in the sales market. So what we do is we just line up all the questions from low to high. The lowest rated one has a rank of 1. The highest rated one has a rank of 15. We skip the the rank for overall satisfaction so that there's continuity between this and the class fingerprint. And so if a question has a rank of 15, then we know that that is the question that was rated the very highest by customers. And there's a bit of a fingerprint or an order which is conducive or predictive of very high sales. And so here are some of those questions. We mentioned them already. Likely to recommend denotes strong market leadership. If you see ratings above a 14 at a 14 or 15, it's an indication that customers are essentially saying, even if their satisfaction is lower, they're essentially saying, but I believe that this is the best product on the market. And when you see a rating below maybe a 5, they're saying, hey, I really think that we're sitting here with a laggard product on the market, and this really makes us nervous. Delivery of new technology is a question whose rank is usually lower. So it starts getting unique when you get above a 6, and that tends to be a really innovative product. Supports integration goals. It can be high, it can be low, but if it's in that top third of questions, if it's above an 11 or so, we start to say, hey, that's a real strength for it, and we tend to see higher sales and higher retention. Executive involvement largely measures the partnership that's going on, and we like to see that usually above a 9. And then forecasted overall satisfaction is a question that really looks at the optimism that customers have in the future. Not a great sales prediction question or rank to be looking at, but a key rank to be looking at that when that really starts to drop, we expect very, very low retention. And when it's high, we expect retention to still stay pretty good. So here's some of the key questions that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to be looking at the ranks for these questions as we go through market segment by market segment. So Kyle, anything that I missed as we walk through this?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. Yeah, looking forward to jumping into each of the segments.
All right, well now the time is for me to ask you a lot of questions about these segments. So you're the expert as we jump in. Let's talk about cardiology first.
Okay.
Philips and IBM Watson, as we look at our decision insights, as we track decisions that are happening in the market, they saw the most decisions last year. However, the model is predicting low sales for those two vendors.
Sure.
And maybe the model is crazy or wrong, but help us understand, why is the model predicting low sales for two products that sold fairly well last year in the cardiology market?
Yeah, if we look at the data here, looking at IBM, their rankings really don't manifest to a high sales prediction. You look at their direct delivery of new technology, it's a 2, and really, I guess that's actually a common pattern we see in imaging, but theirs is especially low. And one of the reasons we see that delivery of new technology is fairly low for everyone is the FDA really controls this space.
Okay.
So it does inhibit faster release of products and updates. But IBM, they're particularly lower here. But then you look at their other rankings, executive involvement, likely to recommend, both 6 and a 3, so pretty low there. Philips, very similar. Their rankings are fairly low. Sorry.
And those likely to recommend, the fact that no one, so you have Epic Cupid at a 7, which is not even very high. So essentially what we're hearing from customers in this market is that nobody's customer base really strongly is indicating that they feel like that they're with the market leader, which is ironic. If nobody's the market leader, then you've got a challenge as a market here, right?
Exactly. But then when you look at Epic and Fuji, who do have a little bit higher sales predictions, they do have the one area that they stand out from everyone else is that executive involvement. Whereas everyone else is kind of similar in their rankings, pretty low, sitting at 6 or 7 or lower in everything else, except for that integration and executive involvement. But where Epic and Fuji really do stand out is that executive involvement.
Okay. What is retention predicted to be? Because we have two different models. We have the sales model, we have the retention model. What do we predict for retention in this market?
Yeah, so if we look at here, just overall, it's pretty average. No one really stands out. So there is an opportunity, if someone can become that kind of go-to product, they could really, there's an opportunity here because you got more than half of the products here are at low retention or very low. And then the others are just at average. So there's a lot of, just based on the rankings we have here, customers are really feeling like there's an opportunity, they're not super happy with their products necessarily.
Yeah.
And so there could be a lot of turnover here.
Yeah, would you say this is a market that is open for some disruption?
Definitely, yeah. That's a really good way to put it, because there's a lot of uncertainty, I guess you could say.
And it's interesting to look even at Epic Cupid, where their likely to recommend rank is a 7. We don't
Yeah.
typically see Epic displaced, and typically we don't see people pulling out Epic Cupid. However, we do sometimes see them adding back in some of the products
Yes.
that they thought that they could turn off, and then they turn it back in with their cardiology reporting in order to be able to do everything that they were hoping to do, right?
Yeah, because with Epic, you have to build it out as a customer. It's a little different than some of the other cardiology products. So there's, yeah, like you said, they're not necessarily getting rid of it, but they're going to continue to use or add in maybe another product that helps them do what they need to do.
Okay. An interesting market.
Yeah.
So if we go from cardiology, and we only, again, have less than 5 minutes to spend on each of these
Sure.
markets. So if we go from cardiology to cardiology hemodynamics, talking about a market that has opportunity for disruption, this is a market that, as we look at the 100 plus markets that KLAS measures, this is one of our sleepiest markets.
Yeah.
And does that show up that way in the predictions here?
Yeah, if we just look at if you look at sales, low sales really for everyone. Very low sales or low sales. No one's really standing out here. And when you look at the rankings, that's what the rankings tell us. Executive involvement's really low for everyone. Delivery of new technology, so not an innovative space here. But like we said, there is some reason for that, but just overall, no one really stands out there. GE and IBM, maybe they're a little bit stronger because their likely to recommend score is higher, or their rank, is quite a bit higher than Philips and Change. But even then, there's really not much energy here for sales in this space.
And in some ways that matches their KLAS scores. So you have GE and IBM scores in the 80s, likely to recommend rank. And GE MacLab, for instance, has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
So customers are saying, hey, this is probably one of the best products on the market. But then you ask, hey, is this developing? Is this moving forward? Are they partnering with you? No, it's a lot the same as how it's been for a long time, but they're supporting it fairly well, right?
Yeah, it gets the job done. Are they moving forward? Not necessarily, but it does what we need it to do. What we're seeing here. And retention is very similar. GE and IBM, not great, but they're at average retention. Again, it's that likely to recommend score that kind of sets them apart from the rest of the segment here. But again, the kind of an opportunity, potentially an opportunity, if someone could come in and disrupt the market, but it's a pretty, like you mentioned, sleepy segment here.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Image Exchange, another market with 4 players in it that we're watching currently.
Yeah.
And you also have another market, but there's even larger gap in this market between your top players who are Nuance and Intelerad, top in terms of KLAS score, I should say.
Yeah.
And who have a little bit of a different prediction. And then you have Life Image and IBM Watson with lower KLAS scores and maybe a little bit lower of a prediction also. So
yeah, interesting. Like you mentioned, that the KLAS scores, there's really a kind of a really big split here. You've got Intelerad and Nuance that are quite a bit higher, both in the low 90s, where IBM and Life fall into the 70s and 60s. And the rankings kind of match the energy there with the scores, especially for Intelerad. At 15 for likely to recommend. Obviously, you're not going to see anything better than that.
Yep.
So they're really strong there. Interesting for them though, their money's worth is really a really high ranking, which I don't know if we talked about, but that's kind of an inverse effect on their prediction. So they're a little high there, but that likely to recommend score really does set them apart, and it's indicated in their high sales prediction.
And as we've talked about, every market is different. We're using the same assumptions to predict across every market. So in as much as Image Exchange maybe is a niche market, maybe this isn't the best predictor of it. If I was to look at any of these questions, I would assume that likely to recommend is the best question to look at across all these different markets.
Sure.
And there's a huge difference in likely to recommend, as you say, with Intelerad at a 15, Nuance at an 11, and then IBM Watson and Life Image at a 2 and a 4.
Yeah.
And so customers are sending a very different signal, and you also see their KLAS scores here in terms of where they're at. But maybe the money's worth is in some of those markets where we don't see as much of a long-term journey. Customers are saying, hey, it's meeting a need today, and maybe we're good. But that also creates an opportunity for someone who can create a long-term journey, if there is one in this space, to come along and create that, right?
Yeah, and I think another thing to look at, and this isn't in the scores, but Intelerad recently acquired Ombra. That's where that came from. And Nuance was acquired by Microsoft. So there's other things outside of the numbers, I guess, to look at that we talked about that don't factor into this, but important to kind of acknowledge that there's a lot happening in some of these spaces. So
that could create some disruption going forward, right?
Certainly.
Yes.
And if we look at retention here, it's kind of the same thing. Intelerad really stands out with really high retention. And again, that likely to recommend carries them, but also forecasted overall satisfaction is pretty good for them. The one kind of interesting thing here, though, is LifeImage, despite, they have very low retention, low sales, they do have a really high forecasted overall satisfaction. So while their class score is pretty low, maybe there's a little bit of optimism there from some of their customers,
Yes.
so there's a potential there for them to, maybe in a year we'll see something different.
Okay. And if we saw that go away, that would start to make us really nervous in
Yeah.
terms of where they're at, right?
Yeah.
No, that's great. Well, let's jump over to oncology now. We're first going to talk about medical oncology and then radiation oncology. Medical oncology, obviously more players in this space. Let's talk about one of the players that's not in radiation oncology and is a little bit newer. I've watched this market for a long time, and Flatiron is a little bit newer, a little bit stronger, more ambulatory customers, so a different makeup of their customer base.
Yeah.
So how are they looking compared to some of the established vendors in the market?
Yeah, according to the model, they're very low sales prediction.
Okay.
So in that you look at delivery of new technology is a 3, whereas you have Epic and Cerner do have 7s, which, like you indicated, that's actually a pretty good score there.
Okay.
They're likely to recommend is an 11. They're a 10, but their integration is a 1. And that could be a little bit because they're ambulatory, right?
Yes.
And then, but some of the things we've seen in their commentary and collecting their data, they're actually really working on their relationships and things. So this is an interesting one where they actually probably are doing a little better than the model indicates.
Okay.
But the model is the model, like you said. It gives us, it shows us, it helps us understand some things, but I think this is one area where, because they're mostly ambulatory, that might hurt their integration rank, because maybe their customers aren't as concerned about that, so it's not as big a deal for them.
And in this market, integration matters a lot, right? These are really sensitive, complex pieces of data, and I even feel sensitive calling them pieces of data because they're so critical to people at such a critical point in their life, right?
Yeah.
And so if you look at the quantification of some of these measures, if I go and have a conversation with you and you are a Flatiron customer, a couple of the things that you on average are rating low are going to be delivery of new technology and integration. So if I started saying, well, what about innovation and what about integration? Well, those are areas where we may have some challenges. If I'm going and looking for an integrative, innovative vendor, that's going to be a concern. If we flip that around, Epic Beacon, I may say, hey, how does the integration go for you? And I've actually talked to some customers about this, and they've said the integration, for instance, between Epic Willow and Epic Beacon is almost seamless. And for us in medical oncology, that's just critical.
Yeah.
And then the other question is, so what do you think about, how likely are you to recommend them compared to somebody else? But maybe actually what I'd be saying is, do you think that they're the best out there if I'm an Epic shop? And if you're an Epic customer, given what we see right now, especially a class score of an 89 and then likely to recommend it a 14, that's a quantification that a lot of their customers are telling others in conversations. Yeah, this is probably the best that you can do out there. So anyway, this model is just a quantification of some of the conversations that we're having and very different conversations that are likely going on if this model is accurate and what we're looking at is accurate, right? So
Definitely.
How about retention?
Let's check that out. So Epic, again, like very strong. You look at their rankings, and that completely explains why. The integration, and Epic's always going to have an advantage with integration, right? Just because they're an enterprise system, you're going to have that opportunity there.
Yep.
Likely to recommend, very strong. And Cerner actually does really well here as well. Their integration is a 15, and then their forecasted overall satisfaction a 13. So those two look really good here. Flatiron and Ontada, they're a little lower, especially Flatiron, and that's just you look at delivery of new technology, and that the integration one for them is really what brings them down. Being a 1, that just is going to drag your predictions down quite a bit.
Okay. And if Cerner had higher satisfaction scores, they would have the very high retention. I mean, their ranks are very similar to what Epic's are, and so that's really probably the piece that pulls them apart the most.
Yeah,
right?
You look at those scores; it's a 12-point difference almost. So while Cerner's rankings are really good, just having a stronger class score would help and just boost them up a little bit.
Okay. No, this is really helpful. Let's jump over to radiation oncology. Two main players here, and Varian showed up with stronger predictions than Elekta.
Yeah.
Walk me through the differences that we see in these two players.
Yeah, it's interesting because the class score isn't that different. It's a 5-point difference, so that's significant, but an 84.9 and an 80, that's close enough. But when you really get into the rankings, likely to recommend really, and supports integration, separate Varian from Elekta. Likely to recommend being a 15, again, that's the best ranking you can get, and that's a really strong predictor of just satisfaction and recommending the product, obviously. And then that integration at 11 versus a 2, that really separates them. Where Elekta does stand out a little bit is that executive involvement compared to Varian. It's an 8 versus a 2, but just Varian's, those two key scores there, likely to recommend an integration, really set it apart.
So if I'm Varian, I may be looking at this and saying, hey, we need to possibly make our relationships stronger, our executive partnership relationship stronger. If I'm Elekta, I'm looking at this and saying, hey, integration has got to get better. And we also need to make sure that our customers know why we are a market leader, which is a challenge to your whole team to make sure that you've created that differentiation between yourselves and everyone else in the market, right?
Yeah. I mean, you look at Varian, they're a good executive involvement rank away from having that very high sales prediction and really kind of maybe running away with it. So
okay. And in a market where we're not seeing tons of buying energy necessarily, you have a lot of people who've had it. So even as we say a product may have very high sales prediction, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're expecting a huge shift this year, because there's got to be some volume flowing through for it to shift those market shares, right?
Yep. But if there were, you would look at Varian as the favorite because they also have that high retention score, or prediction. So yeah, they're set up to do well, but we'll see what happens.
That's great. And this is going to be fun. We're going to come back later and look next year at some of the predictions we made, and then what did we observe in some of our decision insights data. So this is going to be fun. Let's jump over to the PACS market. So you really have two players that stand out in the predictions here. One of them, not too much of a surprise. So you've got Sectra that stands out.
Right.
They have had a lot of sales energy, a lot of momentum over the last few years, have come on strong in probably over the last 5 years or so. But one of the other players that shows up with actually an even higher sales prediction is Agfa Healthcare, with really strong marks and partnership and likely to recommend. Anyway, help us understand what's going on here where Agfa is showing up so strong.
Yeah, a lot of people are looking at them for an enterprise offering. And so, and they've worked on that executive involvement, which is a 15, and you look at those scores, there's only 3, maybe 4 that are above a 10 in the executive involvement rank. So they kind of stand out there quite a bit. Likely to recommend strong enough at a 10, and they're really good with integration as well. So again, their class score is significantly lower than Sectra. Just having those key rankings in those key places is really, making them, giving them the opportunity to have a good year, have good sales.
It's interesting. I was the author on the Enterprise Imaging Report in 2020, and we had some feedback from providers who said, as we highlighted, Agfa is really up and coming. Some customers who are using Impacts and weren't, so this is not Agfa Impacts, which is their historical product. This is Enterprise Imaging for radiology. So some of those customers were saying, hey, is this the same Agfa? Are you talking about a different Agfa? And there was even some distrust towards class in terms of reporting that. So we do see somewhat of a gap today between those enterprise imaging for radiology customers and the Impacts customers. And nothing could show up there more clearly than the executive involvement rank. There's just a lot of touch going on right now with those customers, right?
Yeah, they're really making that a priority, and it's showing. So,
and you mentioned before, you've got a couple players out there showing some innovation, but delivering new technology fairly low in this market. So a fairly mature market. There's also some challenges that make it harder for this market to see as much development, right?
Yeah, like everyone's kind of, they know what the product can do, and it's doing what they need it to do for them. But Novarad and IntelliRad are the two that do stand out with a little bit higher scores there. But yeah, it's a pretty, I don't want to say stagnant, but just not a lot of maybe not a lot of development going on there, but could be an opportunity for someone to, if they can show something there that could set them apart.
We should probably call out Infinite and Philips also. So this is a big list, as they're the next highest in that likely to recommend metric, which is probably frankly the best metric overall of looking at who do customers really feel like is a market leader, which is a very, very strong recommendation that can come from customers, right?
Yeah.
So.
And Infinite also is one of those standouts in executive involvement. So they're, good rankings there for them.
Yeah, they're getting close to that high sales group right there.
Yeah.
So, great.
Did you want to?
What about the retention?
Yeah, I mean, Sectra obviously, with just their strength, their really strong class score, that likely to recommend, their rankings really put them in a place for really high retention prediction. But you have quite a bit of low retention at the bottom there. You look at AGFA, the Impacts product anyway.
Yep.
Which we talked about a little bit, and you look at their rankings, likely to recommend and delivery of new technology, integration, all quite low. But then Philips and GE also pretty low there, and the likely to recommend being a 1, that really brings their retention prediction down quite a bit.
Yeah, and you've got an interesting, so we talked a lot about AGFA on the sales side. Here we are talking about them on the retention side.
Yeah.
Now they've gone from very high to just average, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of that is that their class score is still a 75. So yes, there's a lot of touch. Yes, there's some innovation, and there is some market leadership there. But there's also some other pieces that are holding customers back from being just all the way excited about their vendor. And that's something that we typically see some turnover with, as customers at some point become a little disenchanted with the experience that they're having. So an interesting product and a vendor who's very much probably at a little bit of a fork in the road in terms of which way do they go, right?
Yeah, there's a big opportunity there for them, but yeah, ideally you want to see that class score come up, and that could lead to these predictions holding true.
Okay. Well, there's a lot here, and if you're one of the vendors, again, only vendors who are watching this, if you're one of the vendors who's watching this and you have some questions about your ranks and how can you do better, reach out to the KLAS team. We're excited to walk you through. We don't have time to walk through every single player in this market. Let's jump over though to speech recognition, front-end imaging.
Okay.
You've got 3 main players in this space, and for a long time we've watched and seen some sales. We typically see Dolby show up with fewer sales than we see from 3M and Nuance. And here that's exactly what the model is predicting will continue. So what are some of the differences, and why is the model predicting Dolby to be so much lower?
Yeah, one of the, you look at a couple of the rankings here that really stand out. Nuance, with delivery of new technology, Nuance really stands out. Dolby and 3M are both at a 1. And to see a 10 for Nuance, that's pretty rare to see a 10, especially in the imaging space, but really in anywhere, seeing a 10 that's a big number. So that's what really helps Nuance stand out. But Dolby, they struggle with, likely to recommend is at a 6. Executive involvement's low for everyone, but so really it's that likely to recommend score for Dolby that puts them in that low sales versus high sales.
Okay. So, and it's interesting as we look at this market, as we look at speech overall, you've got Nuance talking a lot about ambient speech, some of these new things that are coming forward. Mm-hmm. I personally haven't seen as much, and I think that what we're seeing here is feedback from customers that they haven't seen as much forward discussions from a 3M, and then definitely not as much from a Dolby. So that number right there is really, really stark. If I'm a 3M and I'm looking at this, I think you start, and the goal here as we talk about this is not to encourage vendors to talk about futures that are not real,
right,
but to really look inside and say, okay, what are we really going to do? What is our roadmap? And really, where are we going? And if we are innovating, but we're just innovating, we're not talking to our customers about it, let's appropriately, without creating promises that we can't deliver on, let's appropriately bring our customers into that discussion. And so there's a lot here to unpack as we look at this. What does retention look like? Because you have Dolby who has very high satisfaction. What does it look like for them?
Yeah, it's kind of the same. I mean, average retention, and really it's that likely to recommend combined with the low delivery of new technology keeps them at an average retention.
Yep.
So, and you look at the others, because a little bit higher likely to recommend, plus coupled with Nuance's really high delivery of new technology, the innovation side of it, that really is what brings them up to that high and very high retention. So.
Okay. No, that's great. Let's jump over. Our last 2 markets here are our enterprise imaging markets.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of sales energy in the universal viewer market. You've got GE and IBM that are lagging quite a ways behind in terms of some of the predictions. But to have 3 very high predictions with Visage, Mach 7, and AGFA, and then a high with Hyland. Anyway, there's a lot of energy in this market.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. So help us unpack what's going on here.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is actually one of the segments in imaging where you see higher delivery of new technology rankings.
Okay.
Hyland's a little bit lower at a 4, but everyone else is a 6, 7, or 8. So little bit more of an innovative segment. And then likely to recommend score is really pretty strong across the board. Integration really strong as well. But whether you see me like Philips drops down a little bit, IBM drops a little bit, and GE as well, they all have a key ranking that's a little bit lower. Looking at Philips, their integration ranking is quite a bit lower than everyone else. GE, they're likely to recommend just is
really low.
Really low, which is
very concerning.
Yes, yeah, and you look at their score, they're almost 10 points lower in class score than Hyland, who's just above them. So there's some concerning numbers there for GE. They do have a good delivery new technology rank and a good executive involvement rank. So there's probably some good effort there happening to try to bring that score up. But yeah, some of those rankings are pretty concerning there.
And it is interesting, a lot of those GE Universal Viewer customers, that's an outgrowth of what they have. They've had GE overall, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're taking that both on the archive side and on the viewer side, they're taking that and extending it, right? And there's some challenges there where they feel like, hey, maybe this isn't what I would have gone and competitively bought, but since we have GE here already, maybe this is what we're going to buy. So we may be seeing some of that reflected in some of this feedback of, I don't think that we actually went out and tried to go buy the market leader.
Yeah.
But very interesting to see 5 of the 7 firms at an 11 or above on likely to recommend. So a lot of people who are using a universal viewer from a firm that they say, hey, I think this is actually one of our best options, which we also see in the class scores where we're mostly low 80s and above. So
yeah, it's pretty consistent segment, I guess you could say, in terms of scores and things like that. Minus, GE is a little bit of an outlier with its lower score, but yeah, interesting segment. And you look at retention, kind of follows the same thing we saw with sales.
Yep.
Really high, high and very high for most of the segment, where IBM's at average and then GE's at low. But and you look at the rankings and that explains it. The likely to recommend for GE and the lower integration for Philips, likely to recommend for IBM as well as GE was what kind of brings their retention down.
Well, let's cap this off by going over and looking at vendor neutral archive.
Yeah.
There's some similarities here where you have a lot of competitive vendors. And then when you look, you see that Hyland's a little bit lower, GE's a little bit lower, IBM Watson, Philips View, I looked wrong, is a little bit lower. And anyway, there's some similarities here. Walk us through, help us unpack some of the similarities there here.
Yeah, another segment that's actually pretty innovative. If you look at those delivery of new technology scores, IBM with a 14, GE and an 11. So you're seeing some innovation, but even with GE again, you're seeing that likely to recommend as at a 1, and their score they're at a 73.8, which is quite a bit lower than several of their competitors. Looking at Philips again, executive involvement is a standout there, where you're seeing a lot of their competitors are much higher, like a 10 or 11 or 14 or whatever, and then they're likely to recommend is also quite lower. So let's see.
The 14 for delivery of new technology on IBM Watson is interesting. I know that there's some talk about where they're going with some of the innovation and some of the AI, but there's also a lot of discussion among customers today. Some of the largest health systems in the country are using IBM and also describe it as just bulletproof when it comes to scalability. So that's got to be a piece that comes into this, is that their archive is very, very strong in terms of scalability, which creates a lot of confidence even with some of the future innovations that come out. There's a feeling that, hey, there's some challenges. So IBM has historically, and I think hopefully doing a little bit better, had some challenges with some of their implementations, but that just rock hard, super strong infrastructure creates a lot of confidence among customers that they are partnering with a really innovative and really forward-looking firm, right?
Yeah, and the ranking definitely bears that out. So
yeah,
and if we look at retention, again, kind of similar. A little, you're seeing some of those that had higher sales have lower retention here, but your 3 lowest scores have low retention predictions, and that correlate. Look at those likely to recommend rankings. That definitely matches up with those predictions there.
And a little bit different than the universal viewer market. I'd say if I was to take a look at both markets, I'd say that the archive market is harder to meet customer needs in.
Sure.
There's just more there. There's just some harder challenges there. And I'm sure somebody could argue on the other side. But we do see here, there's 3 products that score below an 80 and another one that scores right at an 80. So you see more of a differences in class score. And it's really tough to change vendors in the VNA market. But there's an indication that there are some customers who, even if they're not changing today, they're not loving where they're at with their current vendor, right? So,
yeah, it's not an easy rip and replace here, but there's possibility in the next couple of years that, if things don't improve for some of these vendors, there could be some energy for some change there for sure.
Well, this wraps up our quick dive through some of these sales and retention predictions in the imaging space. And I say quick not because quick for each segment as we talked about this. And as you have questions, as we maybe went over it too quickly, and you would like to dig in, the class team would be excited to work with you to talk about how you can be more competitive. We care a lot about helping all of the firms out there be really competitive. This last week we had a conference and I was talking to a CIO and he said, wouldn't it be wonderful if every vendor option that we had was incredibly competitive? And so the voice from a provider executive, that's really our goal with this whole effort. We're excited to work with you and continue to have a dialogue about the insights that we can learn from this model. So thank you so much.
Thank you.